A fight for dignity and accessibility. It started with a simple act of love, building a wheelchair ramp to help my daughter live more freely in the home we've called ours for over a decade. What should have been a moment of pride, empowerment, and progress quickly turned into an emotional roller coaster when our Homeowners Association, HOA, president stepped in with a surprising and disheartening objection. Without warning, without empathy, and without regard for the needs of someone with a disability, the president tried to ban my daughter's ramp. I remember the day I got the letter from the HOA board like it was yesterday. It was crisp, formal, and cold. Violation of architectural guidelines. That's all it said at first glance. But inside was a demand that felt more like an attack than a request: remove the ramp or face fines, legal action, and potential liens on our property. The reasoning? The ramp didn't match the aesthetic of the neighborhood. It wasn't approved by the Architectural Review Committee. And worst of all, there was no mention of compassion, no acknowledgement of my daughter's condition, no effort to understand what this ramp meant, not just for her mobility, but for her dignity. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe the HOA president hadn't read the full context. Maybe they didn't know who my daughter was, or how hard she'd worked to live independently. So I reached out. I wrote back, politely explaining the situation, attaching medical documentation, and even offering to adjust the design if needed. Instead of empathy, I received silence, or worse, passive-aggressive responses and bureaucratic deflections. This wasn't just about a ramp anymore. It was about respect. It was about inclusion. It was about standing up against outdated rules that prioritize curb appeal over human need. And as I began talking to neighbors, friends, and other parents of children with disabilities, I realized this wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a much larger issue across HOAs nationwide. So, I decided to fight back, not just for my daughter, but for every family that's ever been told their struggle doesn't fit within someone else's idea of perfection. This is the story of that battle, a battle not just against a misguided HOA president, but against a system that too often forgets that homes are more than just houses. They're places where people live, grow, and thrive. And sometimes, thriving means needing a little extra support. Let me take you through the journey, the outrage, the advocacy, the community support, and ultimately, the victory that reminded us all of what truly matters. My daughter, Emily, has always been a fighter. Born with cerebral palsy, she's faced challenges most of us can't imagine, but never once has she let them define her. She learned to walk with braces, then later transitioned to a walker, and now uses a manual wheelchair for mobility. Despite these obstacles, she's a bright, determined young woman with dreams of becoming a graphic designer. Her independence means everything to her, and being able to navigate our home without assistance is a crucial part of that. Our house, a modest two-story colonial in a quiet suburban neighborhood, had served us well for years. But as Emily grew older and her mobility needs changed, we knew something had to give. Climbing stairs became increasingly difficult, and while we did our best to accommodate her downstairs, it wasn't sustainable long-term. We explored options, installing a stair lift, converting the garage into a living space, even considering moving altogether. But none of those solutions felt right. We loved our home, our neighbors, and the life we'd built here. Then, we landed on the idea of building a wheelchair ramp to the second floor. Our house has a side entrance that leads directly to a landing outside Emily's bedroom window. With some structural adjustments, we could install a sturdy, safe, and aesthetically pleasing ramp that would allow her full access to her room and bathroom without relying on others for help. We hired a contractor who specialized in accessibility modifications. He walked us through the process, ensuring the ramp met ADA standards and local building codes. We chose materials that matched the exterior of our home, natural wood with steel railings, to blend seamlessly with the existing structure. Every detail was carefully considered, from the slope of the incline to the handrails and non-slip surface. Construction took about 3 weeks. Each day, I watched as the ramp came together piece by piece, feeling a growing sense of hope and excitement. This wasn't just a construction project, it was a symbol of freedom for Emily. For the first time, she would be able to enter and exit her room on her own terms, without having to ask for help. She wouldn't feel confined or dependent. She would feel empowered. When the ramp was finally completed, we invited Emily to see it. She wheeled herself toward it slowly, eyes wide with disbelief. Then, with a grin that lit up her entire face, she rolled forward and climbed the ramp unassisted for the first time. I'll never forget that moment, her laughter echoing through the air, her voice filled with joy as she shouted, "I did it. Mom, I did it." That night, we celebrated. Pizza, ice cream, and a proud hug that lasted longer than usual. It was a milestone, not just for Emily, but for our entire family. We had taken a major step toward making our home truly accessible and inclusive. Or so we thought. 2 days later, the HOA letter arrived. The joy we had felt was suddenly replaced by confusion and frustration. How could something so necessary, so life-changing, be seen as a violation? We had followed all the proper procedures, consulted professionals, and ensured the ramp was both functional and visually harmonious with the rest of the house. Yet, according to the HOA, it was an eyesore that violated the neighborhood's architectural guidelines. I couldn't believe what I was reading. This wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about accessibility, safety, and basic human rights. And yet, the HOA president seemed to care more about maintaining a certain look than supporting a resident in need. Still, I held on to hope that this was a misunderstanding. Surely, once they understood the situation, they would see reason. I gathered Emily's medical records, photos of the ramp, and a heartfelt letter explaining its importance. I sent it to the HOA board, expecting a quick resolution. Instead, I received another letter, this time, more aggressive in tone. The HOA president refused to grant an exception. The ramp, they insisted, must come down. That's when I realized, this wasn't going to be easy. This was going to be a fight. The next meeting with the HOA board was tense. I had hoped for a rational discussion, perhaps even a compromise. But instead, I was met with resistance from the very beginning. The president, Mr. Richard Langston, sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Around him were 5 other board members, some familiar faces, others new to me. None of them looked particularly eager to hear my side of the story. I stood up and gave a short presentation. I showed them photos of the ramp, explained how it allowed Emily to move freely and safely in and out of her room, and emphasized that we had gone above and beyond to ensure it blended with the house. I shared a few personal anecdotes about Emily's daily struggles before the ramp was installed, hoping to evoke some level of empathy. I even offered to repaint or reconfigure parts of the ramp if they had specific concerns. But Mr. Langston cut me off mid-sentence. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice measured but firm, "we appreciate your efforts, but the fact remains that the ramp violates our architectural guidelines. These rules exist to maintain the integrity of the neighborhood and protect property values." His words stung. Asterisk integrity of the neighborhood? Property values? Asterisk was that really more important than allowing a child with a disability to live comfortably in her own home? I asked for clarification. Are you saying that regardless of the circumstances, regardless of my daughter's medical needs, you still expect us to remove the ramp? Mr. Langston nodded. Yes. Unless you can provide an exemption based on a legitimate hardship, which we do not currently recognize. I was stunned. Legitimate hardship? I repeated. She uses a wheelchair. She can't climb stairs. Isn't that hardship enough? One of the board members, Mrs. Karen Delaney, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. We understand that, she said gently, but exemptions aren't granted lightly. We have to consider the precedent this might set. Precedent? I nearly laughed. You mean, you're worried other homeowners might want to build ramps for their disabled family members, and you don't want to deal with that paperwork? Mr. Langston cleared his throat. That's not exactly what we're saying, but yes, we have to maintain consistency. If we make an exception for one person, we open the door for others to request similar changes, and we simply don't have the capacity to evaluate each case individually. So you'd rather enforce a rule that makes life harder for people in need? I shot back. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his tone was colder. We're not trying to make anyone's life harder. We're trying to preserve the character of our community. That includes visual harmony. That includes standards. I wanted to scream. Standards? Visual harmony? Since when did those things outweigh compassion? The meeting ended with no resolution. I left feeling defeated, frustrated, and deeply concerned. We had spent thousands of dollars on the ramp. More importantly, Emily had gained a newfound sense of independence. Now, all of that was under threat. Back home, I relayed the conversation to my husband, Mark. He was furious. They can't just force us to tear it down, he said. There have to be laws protecting people with disabilities. I nodded. There should be. But I don't know how HOA rules interact with federal laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act. We need to find out. That night, I stayed up researching. I scoured government websites, legal forums, and advocacy groups focused on disability rights. What I found both reassured and alarmed me. Under the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, homeowners with disabilities are entitled to reasonable accommodations, including structural modifications like ramps, grab bars, widened doorways, and more, as long as they meet safety standards and don't pose an undue burden on the HOA. In theory, this meant we had a strong legal foundation to challenge the HOA's decision. But in practice, enforcement was tricky. Many HOAs operate under private governance, meaning they aren't technically subject to the same scrutiny as public entities. As long as their rules don't explicitly discriminate, they can enforce strict aesthetic guidelines, even if those guidelines disproportionately affect people with disabilities. Still, I wasn't ready to give up. If we had legal recourse, we had to use it. But first, we needed to rally support. Because this wasn't just about us anymore, it was about setting a precedent for everyone in the community who might one day need similar accommodations. And that's when I decided to go public. Going public, raising awareness and building support. I knew that fighting the HOA president alone wouldn't be enough. If we wanted real change, we needed to bring attention to the issue, to show the community, the media, and even lawmakers that this wasn't just about one family's ramp, but about the broader issue of accessibility and fairness in HOA-governed neighborhoods. So, I started small. I posted a detailed account of our experience on Facebook, tagging the HOA page and using relevant hashtags like #AccessibilityMatters and #FairHousingRights. Within hours, the post exploded. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers commented in outrage. Some shared their own stories of battling HOAs over minor renovations, while others expressed deep sympathy for Emily and our situation. One comment in particular caught my eye. It was from a local journalist named Sarah Martinez, who had covered housing discrimination issues before. She messaged me privately, asking if I'd be willing to speak on record. I hesitated at first. Going public meant exposing ourselves to criticism, legal threats, and potentially more conflict with the HOA. But then I thought about Emily. About her smile when she first used the ramp. About how unfair it was that someone would try to take that away from her. And I knew we had to stand up. Sarah published the article the next day on the city's largest online news platform. The headline read, "Local Family Fights HOA Over Wheelchair Ramp for Teen with Cerebral Palsy." The piece included quotes from me, details about the HOA's refusal to grant an exemption, and insights from a disability rights attorney who confirmed that our case had merit under the Fair Housing Act. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By noon, the article had gone viral on social media. Local radio stations picked up the story. A regional TV news crew contacted us for an interview. And then, unexpectedly, a national disability advocacy group reached out to offer legal support. Meanwhile, support from our neighbors poured in. People we barely knew showed up at our house with signs that read "Emily deserves access" and "Keep the ramp." A petition started circulating online, demanding that the HOA reverse its decision. Within 48 hours, it had over 20,000 signatures. Even more surprising was the reaction from some HOA board members. Mrs. Karen Delaney, the one who had seemed uncomfortable during our meeting, reached out personally. She apologized for how things had unfolded and admitted that the board had not fully understood the implications of denying our request. She assured me that she would push for reconsideration at the next board meeting. But Mr. Langston remained unmoved. In a statement issued by the HOA, he reiterated the organization's stance: while we sympathize with the Thompson family's situation, we must remain consistent in enforcing our architectural guidelines. Making exceptions sets dangerous precedents. Dangerous precedents? I couldn't believe what I was reading. Protecting the rights of people with disabilities was now considered a dangerous precedent? Still, the pressure continued to mount. At a town hall meeting organized by concerned residents, dozens of people spoke out in favor of keeping the ramp. One speaker, a veteran who used a mobility scooter, shared how difficult it had been for him to get approval for a similar modification. Another parent, whose son had muscular dystrophy, urged the HOA to reconsider its rigid policies. Even local politicians began weighing in. Councilwoman Lisa Chen released a statement calling the HOA's actions discriminatory and out of touch with modern values of inclusion and accessibility. State Representative James Alvarez announced plans to introduce legislation clarifying that HOAs cannot override federal disability protections. All of this culminated in a critical moment, the next HOA board meeting, where our case would be reviewed again. This time, the room was packed. Supporters lined the walls, many wearing blue ribbons in solidarity with Emily. Reporters scribbled notes furiously. Cameras recorded every word. I stood up and addressed the board once more. "You say you value consistency," I said, voice steady. "But what kind of consistency are you upholding? One that denies people with disabilities the right to live independently? One that prioritizes paint colors over human dignity? You have the power to do the right thing. Please, do the right thing." For a long moment, there was silence. Then, Mrs. Delaney stood. "On behalf of the board," she said, "we acknowledge that our previous decision was made without fully understanding the legal and ethical implications. After reviewing the Fair Housing Act and consulting with legal counsel, we have determined that we must approve the Thompson family's request for a reasonable accommodation." A wave of relief washed over me. Applause erupted from the crowd. Mr. Langston looked visibly displeased, but he didn't object. The vote was unanimous. The ramp would stay. The moment the vote was cast and the board officially approved our request, I felt a rush of emotions: relief, vindication, gratitude. But also, a deep sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about our family anymore. It was about every person who had ever been denied access to their own home because of arbitrary HOA rules. It was about proving that communities can evolve, that inclusivity can triumph over outdated norms. In the days following the decision, the atmosphere in our neighborhood changed. Strangers became allies. Neighbors we rarely spoke to brought over cookies and cards of encouragement. Even some former skeptics within the HOA began advocating for policy reforms to prevent future conflicts like ours. More importantly, the story sparked a larger conversation about accessibility and the role of HOAs in shaping residential communities. Several neighboring HOAs reached out to us, asking for guidance on updating their own policies to better accommodate residents with disabilities. A local university even invited me to speak at a symposium on housing equity and fair treatment under private governance. The biggest surprise came from the state capitol. A week after the ruling, I received a call from Representative Alvarez's office. They were drafting legislation that would require all HOAs to comply with federal disability laws, eliminating the loophole that allowed them to deny reasonable accommodations under the guise of architectural control. They wanted my input on the language of the bill. It was surreal. Just a month ago, I was a mom fighting for her daughter's right to use a ramp. Now, I was helping shape statewide policy. Of course, not everyone was happy with the outcome. Mr. Langston resigned from the HOA board shortly after the vote, citing personal reasons. Rumor has it he moved out of the neighborhood entirely. While I didn't wish ill will on him, I couldn't help but feel that his departure signaled a shift toward a more compassionate leadership. The board appointed Mrs. Delaney as interim president, and under her leadership, they launched a task force to review all HOA policies related to accessibility, emergency modifications, and fair housing compliance. They also established a formal appeals process for residents facing similar disputes. Emily, meanwhile, thrived. Being able to navigate her room independently gave her a confidence boost she had never experienced before. She started applying for internships, joined a youth advocacy group for teens with disabilities, and even gave a speech at a local school about the importance of accessibility. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, she turned to me and said, "Mom, I know this was hard, but I'm glad we did it. Not just for me, but for everyone else who needs something like this." Tears welled up in my eyes. That was all the validation I needed. Looking back, I realize how easy it would have been to back down. To quietly remove the ramp and avoid confrontation. But doing so would have meant accepting injustice, not just for us, but for countless others who might follow. Instead, we chose to stand up, to raise our voices, and to remind the world that accessibility isn't a luxury. It's a right. Our fight may have started with a simple wheelchair ramp, but it led to something far greater, a stronger, more inclusive community, and a renewed commitment to fairness in housing for all. If there's one lesson I've learned from this experience, it's that change doesn't happen unless someone is willing to speak up. Too often, people assume that institutions like HOAs have the final say, that challenging them is futile or even foolish. But the truth is, when you stand on the side of justice, when you fight for something that matters, you're never truly alone. To any parent, homeowner, or advocate facing a similar battle, don't back down. Know your rights. Understand the laws that protect you. Reach out to organizations that specialize in disability rights and fair housing. Most importantly, don't be afraid to tell your story. Sharing your experience can inspire others to join your cause, and together, you can create meaningful change. To HOA boards and community leaders, listen. Be proactive in reviewing your policies to ensure they align with federal and state accessibility laws. Recognize that beauty and uniformity should never come at the cost of dignity and inclusion. Work with residents, not against them. Create spaces where people feel valued, supported, and free to live their lives to the fullest. And to lawmakers and policymakers, close the loopholes. Strengthen the protections for homeowners with disabilities so that no one has to fight the same battle we did. Ensure that HOAs are held accountable for discriminatory practices disguised as architectural oversight. Make accessibility not just an option, but a standard. Our story is just one of many. Across the country, families are struggling with inaccessible homes, restrictive rules, and uncaring bureaucracies. But every time someone stands up, every time someone refuses to accept injustice, the tide begins to turn. Let our fight be a reminder that accessibility isn't just about ramps and rails, it's about respect, opportunity, and the fundamental right to live with dignity in the place you call home. And let it be a call to action, for all of us.